Hello there. Today, I'd like to take you on an ASMR adventure into the world of a writer who has enthralled, mystified, fascinated, and sometimes frustrated her readers. Agatha Christie. During her lifetime, Christie was known as the Queen of Crime, and she was, and still is, an incredibly popular author of murder mystery novels and short stories. So, in this talk, we're going to take a look at her extraordinary life and her prodigious output of work. And in addition, I'm going to discuss 3 particular Christie novels that I think especially highlight some of the interesting aspects of her work. However, as I talk about these books and about her work in general, I will be very careful not to let slip any obvious spoilers about the plots. So if you haven't read the novels in question, don't worry. You can still listen to this talk in safety without inadvertently discovering whodunnit. As usual, there'll be an accompanying slideshow of images, and quite a few of these are photographs of my own personal collection of Christie novels. However, there's no need for you to look at these if you don't want to. If you prefer, you can just close your eyes, relax, and let my voice guide you. So, welcome to the history and mystery of Agatha Christie. Christie was the youngest daughter of Clarissa and Frederick Miller, a prosperous Anglo-American family who were lucky enough to have inherited wealth and were consequently able to enjoy a very comfortable and genteel lifestyle. They lived in a large and elegant early Victorian villa called Ashfield, which was situated in the English seaside town of Torquay, down on the southwest coast of Devon. And it was here, in September 1890, that their 3rd child, Agatha, was born. Sadly, Ashfield no longer exists, but in her autobiography, Christie remembered it as a house with large and beautiful gardens, where she would play with her elder siblings, Margaret, known as Madge, and Louis, who was nicknamed Monty. In later years, Christie would describe her early childhood as being rather idyllic. But grief overtook the family in 1901 when Frederick Miller died from pneumonia. After her father's death, the young Agatha grew even closer to her mother, and once she'd completed her education at a finishing school in Paris, mother and daughter went travelling together to Cairo because Clarissa Miller had a fairly fragile state of health, and so she'd been advised by her doctor to try a warmer climate. Together, Clarissa and Agatha visited the pyramids at Giza, and the trip fostered a passion for archaeology and Egyptology in Agatha that would continue for the rest of her life, and which in the short term also inspired her to try her hand at novel writing. Her first foray into the novel genre was a romance set in Cairo called Snow Upon the Desert, and it was roundly rejected by every publisher she sent it to. However, by the end of 1912, the aspiring young author had become somewhat distracted from her writing ambitions by a romance of her own. She fell in love with a handsome young officer in the Royal Flying Corps called Archibald Christie, and on Christmas Eve 1914, just a few short months after World War I had broken out, Agatha and Archie were married. At the time, the received wisdom about the First World War was that it would be over by Christmas, but of course it wasn't. And when Archie was posted to France, Agatha decided that she would do her own bit for the war effort too. So she began to volunteer for the Red Cross, working first as a nurse and then later as a pharmacy dispenser. Just like her earlier trip to Egypt, her experiences with the Red Cross would become a key inspiration for her writing. As a dispenser, she developed an in-depth knowledge of drugs and poisons, and as a nurse, she helped to treat a group of Belgian refugees and soldiers who had settled in Torquay after the invasion of their homeland by Germany. Inspired by these new acquaintances, Christie began work on another novel in 1916, and this time it was a detective story called The Mysterious Affair at Styles. It featured a Belgian refugee as its main protagonist, a funny little police officer from Brussels who had an egg-shaped head and a set of remarkable moustaches, and was called Hercule Poirot. It's said that Christie wrote The Mysterious Affair at Styles after being egged on to it by her sister, Madge, who challenged her to write a detective story. However, what began as a dare would eventually launch Christie's career as a writer. To begin with, she was again rejected by several publishers, but The Mysterious Affair at Styles was finally published in the autumn of 1920. And although the novel received mixed reviews, Christie's ability to plot an ingenious murder mystery was noted and remarked upon from the very beginning. All the hallmarks of a classic Agatha Christie story are present in the book. The rambling country house setting, the extended cast of suspects that are made up from the family at the house and also their immediate associates in the local village, the red herrings that are deliberately used to lead the reader off in the wrong direction, and the ingenious detective who puzzles out the solution to the crime and who uses a trusty but slightly clueless sidekick as a convenient sounding board for his deductions. The brilliant detective with the charmingly obtuse assistant wasn't a new idea. It had been used by various previous detective novel writers, most successfully, of course, by the author Conan Doyle in his Sherlock Holmes stories. However, Christie had no qualms about taking ideas from books she'd already read and readjusting them to suit her own purposes. So she created her own detecting duo in the form of Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings. Captain Arthur Hastings is an enthusiastic but not overly bright English army officer who narrates The Mysterious Affair at Styles in the first person, and who turns out to be the perfect foil to Poirot. He's the decent, loyal, charming and courageous sidekick, who is also endearingly woolly-headed and sometimes prone to let his old-fashioned ideas lead him down a blind alley, often with comic effect. By contrast, Poirot himself is a detecting genius, and he's very happy to declare himself as such. Interestingly, his name appears to be a mashup of two former fictional detectives, Hercule Poirot, who appears in the novels of Marie Belle-aux-Clowns, and Monsieur Poiret, who's also a retired Belgian police officer, and who crops up in the work of Frank Howell Evans. However, if Christie borrowed a little too heavily from these authors, she also soon eclipsed them with her own take on a Belgian detective, a precise, elegant, and eccentric little man whose brilliance at solving crimes stems from his ability to deconstruct the psychology of a case and understand the mind of a murderer. As Christie's career progressed, Poirot would become an iconic figure within the canon of crime and detective fiction, and in The Mysterious Affair at Styles, Captain Hastings describes, for the very first time, some of those traits that would become Poirot's trademarks. He was hardly more than 5 feet 4 inches, but carried himself with great dignity. His head was exactly the shape of an egg, and he always perched it a little on one side. His moustache was very stiff and military. Even if everything on his face was covered, the tips of moustache and the pink-tipped nose would be visible. The neatness of his attire was almost incredible. I believe a speck of dust would have caused him more pain than a bullet wound. Agatha Christie would return to Hercule Poirot again and again in her stories, and he appears in more than 85 of her works. He's also been played on screen, with varying degrees of success, by actors ranging from Albert Finney and Peter Ustinov to Kenneth Branagh. However, it's generally agreed that the actor who's come closest to defining the essence of Poirot on screen is David Suchet. Suchet is a British actor who starred in the long-running TV series Agatha Christie's Poirot, and he did an amazing and meticulous job of bringing the Belgian sleuth to life. He's not an absolutely perfect embodiment of the character. He doesn't, for example, have any of the frenetically active traits that Christie gives to her Belgian detective. She makes a note in the novels of pointing out how active Poirot is. He's always leaping about and dashing around in pursuit of the truth. Suchet doesn't play him that way. He makes Poirot a far more sedate character. However, I think this is a fairly minor deviation in an otherwise wonderfully authentic interpretation. Christie followed the mysterious affair at Styles with a second novel called The Secret Adversary, and for this story she replaced Poirot and Hastings with a different detecting duo, the young couple Tommy and Tuppence. They would go on to feature in several more of her works, but their stories tend to function more as action-adventures rather than murder mysteries. Tommy and Tuppence are a couple of exceedingly patriotic upper-class Brits who like nothing more than running around in hot pursuit of wartime spies, and as a result I personally find that their capers read more like the gung-ho thrillers of John Buchan, the author of the 39 Steps, whose stories were incredibly popular in their day, but haven't aged particularly well. Part of the reason for this aging in Christie's work is down to the red herrings that she chooses to use in order to distract her readers from what's really happening in the plot. As an author, she was utterly brilliant at creating misdirection, but her success in achieving it is often reliant on her ability to anticipate the entrenched beliefs or assumptions of her readers, which she then of course overturns to create a surprising denouement. However, in the Tommy and Tuppence plots, I think those assumptions are often simply a little too crass for a thoughtful modern readership. They rely on the reader having strong prejudices about class, nationality, and gender that, hopefully, aren't quite so prevalent today as they were in former times. Consequently, when you set those prejudices aside, the mysteries at the heart of the stories become pretty easy to solve, and the fun of guessing who done it is replaced by a certain frustration at the hero and heroine's apparent cluelessness at what appears to be obvious to a modern reader. By contrast, although the Poirot books do also sometimes contain elements of xenophobia and prejudice, in general they've aged much better, simply I think because Poirot himself is a Belgian refugee, and consequently the English character's tendency to dismiss him with snobbery or act with prejudice against him is undercut, often in a very humorous way, by the fact that Poirot is, of course, far more intelligent than they are. Christie returned to Poirot for her third novel, Murder on the Links, and having got into her stride as an author, she continued to work at an impressively prodigious rate, publishing at least one new work every year for the next 50 years, which is an incredible achievement, a testimony not only to Christie's imagination, but also to her work ethic. By 1926, her reputation was well established as an ingenious writer of crime fiction. However, in her personal life, she was beginning to struggle. In the April of 1926, her mother, whom she'd remained very close to, died, and the acute grief that resulted from this loss triggered Christie into a deep depression. Then, just 4 months later, came a second blow. Her husband Archie announced that he'd fallen in love with a girl called Nancy Neal, and he told his wife that he wanted a divorce. By the end of that year, the couple had reached breaking point, and after a bitter argument, on the 3rd of December, Archie left Agatha alone to spend the weekend with friends, and Agatha got into her car and drove away. A few hours later, her car was then found abandoned by a quarry, but the author herself had completely disappeared. The mystery that surrounds this disappearance of Agatha Christie has been much written about over the years, but never fully resolved. She was found 10 days later after a highly publicised search by both police and journalists, and she was staying under a pseudonym at the Swan Hotel in Harrogate in North Yorkshire. In subsequent interviews, she never made any reference to her disappearance, nor attempted an explanation for it, and consequently, various different theories have evolved around it. It's been claimed at various times that her motive was a cover story for a suicide attempt, that it was a cynical publicity stunt to promote her books, and even that it was an attempt by Christie to frame her husband for her own murder. However, no one really knows for certain why she chose to disappear, and my guess would be that after going through such an emotionally tumultuous year, her mental health was understandably fragile, and her actions were a spontaneous physical response to her state of mind. However, that is merely a supposition on my part. I don't know for sure what lay behind her disappearance, and I doubt we will ever fully solve the mystery of Agatha Christie's escapade at the Swan Hotel. But speaking as someone who knows the town of Harrogate very well indeed, I can't help feeling that, whether by accident or design, Christie chose the perfect place to stage her own mystery. Harrogate is an affluent and attractive spa town with a charming vintage vibe, but beneath the refined surface, who knows what intrigues and resentments are simmering. It is, in fact, exactly the sort of seemingly respectable and sedate place where Christie might have set one of her own novels. Once her divorce was finalised in 1928, the author began a new chapter of her life, and she kicked it off by travelling to Baghdad via Istanbul on the Orient Express. The journey was to provide her with partial inspiration for one of her most celebrated novels, which we'll come back to later on. However, the trip was also life-changing in another way, because while she was in Iraq, Christie became friends with a couple of married archaeologists, Catherine and Leonard Woolley, and later on they invited her to join them on a dig. On that dig she met a young archaeologist called Max Mallowan, and after a courtship of just 7 months, Christie and Mallowan were married in September 1930. The union turned out to be incredibly happy and successful, and it also expanded Christie's early love of archaeology. She enthusiastically accompanied her husband on his various excavations across the Middle East, and she frequently used the places they visited together as settings for her novels, including Death on the Nile Murder in Mesopotamia, and They Came to Baghdad. 1930 was also the year that Christie published a novel with a new sleuth. Not a professional detective this time, but an elderly lady with a beady gaze, an ear for gossip, and a tendency to think the worst of people. This, of course, was Miss Marple. She wasn't a brand new creation. Her first appearance had actually been in a short story that Christie had written back in 1927 called The Tuesday Night Club. But in 1930, with the publication of Murder at the Vicarage, Miss Marple ascended to her own novel, and it was to be the first of many. Like Poirot, Miss Marple has become an iconic fictional detective, although unlike him, she doesn't have a regular sidekick. For every case, there's always a friend of a friend, a convenient godchild, an old acquaintance, or a former maid who just happens to pop up to lend assistance when necessary. Miss Marple has been brought to life on screen by many different actors over the years, including Margaret Rutherford, Angela Lansbury, Joan Hickson, Geraldine McEwen, and Julia Mackenzie. Agatha Christie herself met Joan Hickson when she was a young actor and thought she would be the perfect casting for Miss Marple once she was old enough to play the role. Hickson then did actually go on to play the character, and most people tend to agree that her performance is the one which is most faithful to the character that Christie wrote. However, I must confess that I have a soft spot for the interpretation of Marple by the late, great Geraldine McEwen. I'll freely admit that it isn't a terribly accurate representation, but then again, I don't personally find Miss Marple to be a particularly likeable character, so I rather enjoy McEwen's slightly more whimsical and mischievous take on the lady. Christie invented other fictional sleuths, such as Parker Pyne and Harley Quinn, but Poirot and Miss Marple would remain her most popular creations. She continued to write stories and novels about them right up until her death in 1976. And in parallel to her career as a detective fiction writer, she also branched out into other genres, writing romances under the name Mary Westmacott and adapting several of her murder mysteries into plays. One of these plays, The Mousetrap, still holds the record for the longest play run in history. It opened in the West End of London in 1952, and it's still running today, although of course as I record this, all the West End theatres are currently closed due to COVID-19. I have no doubt though that when they reopen, The Mousetrap will too. Meanwhile, in the 40-plus years since Christie's death, her books have continued to sell by the millions. According to the Guinness Book of World Records, she's the best-selling novelist of all time, and her works have been translated into over 100 languages. There's something about Agatha Christie's stories that simply mesmerizes readers, and also confounds her would-be critics, who can't put their finger on why her books are so appealing. No one can doubt that she's brilliant at creating ingenious mysteries that are very difficult to solve. But personally, I feel there's more to her popularity than just the ability to create a fiendish puzzle. Christie isn't perhaps the most eloquent or sophisticated writer, nor is she always particularly original in her use of characterization, and the setups for her plots can become formulaic at times. Nevertheless, her books continue to resonate with readers, and so, to finish off this talk, I'm going to take a closer look at 3 particular Christie novels that I think highlight some of the other compelling and appealing qualities in her work, and which help to shine a light on her success as an author. Book 1. The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd was published in 1926, and it features Hercule Poirot, supposedly just after his retirement, to a little cottage in the village of King's Abbot. There, his friend Roger Ackroyd is murdered, and so Poirot immediately comes out of retirement to investigate his friend's death. Unlike earlier Poirot novels, this one doesn't feature Captain Hastings, and so it's narrated instead in the first person by Poirot's neighbour, the village doctor James Shepherd, who assists Poirot in his investigations and, just like Hastings before him, keeps a record of them. This is one of my favourite Agatha Christie novels. It's ingeniously plotted and faultlessly executed in ways that I'm not even going to attempt to discuss, because I don't want to give away the ending. However, it's also a great example of how Christie uses humour in her work, both to entertain her readers, provoke them, and occasionally to misdirect them. We don't necessarily always think of the murder mystery genre as being humorous, but Christie had a good ear for comic dialogue, and she uses it to particularly entertaining effect in Chapter 15 of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, where Dr. Shepherd, the narrator, invites some of his village neighbours to spend the evening playing mahjong with him and his sister Caroline. Christie gives Shepherd, as the narrator, a satirical eye and a laconic style of expression, and as he relays the details of this soirée, cutting between the ins and outs of the mahjong game, and then the dialogue that is going on around the table at the same time, the scene becomes a beautifully observed study of the gossiping middle classes at play. Between cries of "pung" and "unpung," tittle-tattle is exchanged, rumours are picked apart, and the underlying malice of this supposedly respectable and nice group of neighbours is revealed in a way that is both sly and hilarious. Christie frequently uses apparently throwaway lines of dialogue to point up the underlying psychology and motivation of her characters, but I don't think she's always given enough credit for the humour in her dialogue. Some of it is laugh-out-loud funny, and in this mahjong scene in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, Christie creates that comic dialogue with such a light and satirical touch that I would say it's almost on a par with a paragraph from Jane Austen. And if you've listened to any of my previous talks on Jane Austen, you'll know that coming from me, that's high praise indeed. Book 2. Murder on the Orient Express. 6 years after travelling on the Orient Express herself, Christie published a novel that was partly inspired by her own journey, but was also partly inspired by an horrific true-life crime that had taken place in 1932. The kidnap and murder of Charles Lindbergh Jr., the 20-month-old son of the aviator Charles Lindbergh and his wife Anne. Christie includes quite a few elements from this dreadful real-life case within her story, the tale of a murder that takes place on the Calais coach of the Orient Express train. When the train becomes stuck in a snowdrift, Hercule Poirot, who just happens to be on board, has to work out which of the passengers is a murderer. Murder on the Orient Express is perhaps Agatha Christie's most famous novel, so I'm sure many of my listeners already know whodunnit in this case. Nevertheless, for those that don't, I'm not going to say. And the reason I've chosen it for my selection is because I think it also clearly demonstrates how Christie could weave together light and dark subject matter in one story. Her books are often referred to these days as cosy crime drama, and there's no doubt that they do certainly work on one level as entertaining fantasies. I suspect this was deliberate on Christie's part, and that the very reason why she used the same scenarios and plot devices over and over again was because she understood that the English country houses, the quaint villages, the glittering London parties, and all the other trappings of social affluence that appear in her books, appealed very directly to readers who were looking for escapism. As the years have passed, that escapism has, of course, become even more pointed, as subsequent generations conveniently forget about the hardships of the interwar and post-war years, and the novels take on a charming vintage perspective. Nevertheless, while Christie is very adept at describing all these trappings of luxury, and making her books so appealing as a result, she's also unsparing in the crimes she depicts. Her work might not be as graphic or as gory as some modern crime writers, but that doesn't prevent some of the murders she invents being genuinely disturbing. This disturbing quality is quite often played down in the screen adaptations of Murder on the Orient Express, but if you've read the actual novel, then you'll know that it's a chilly and chilling story about a crime that has a distressing real-life murder at its heart. It mixes together the fantasy of a deluxe train with stylish compartments and glamorous passengers, with the cruel murder of a child and the terrible psychological devastation that's left behind by such a callous act. This is a potent and incredibly unsettling combination. It's a very compelling story that demonstrates Christie's ability to interweave dark and light subjects, but it's not at all, in my view, a cosy novel. Book 3. Crooked House. Crooked House is one of Christie's most original examples of a country house murder, and I've chosen it because I think it highlights yet another key theme in her work that isn't always acknowledged: her ability to accurately observe and delineate toxic family relationships. The novel was written in 1949, and it's narrated by a young Englishman called Charles Haywood, who attempts to solve the murder of Aristide Leonides, a millionaire tycoon who was the grandfather of the woman that Haywood wishes to marry. Rather conveniently, Haywood also just happens to be the son of the Assistant Commissioner of Scotland Yard, and so with police resources at his disposal and the blessing of his fiancée, he travels to Three Gables, which is the Leonides country residence and the crooked house of the title. Whilst Haywood is supposedly the dashing young hero of the novel, he suffers rather too much from many of those prejudices that we already discussed in the Tommy and Tuppence novels. He makes sweeping assumptions about class, gender, and nationality that prevent him from being truly effective as a detective. Instead, his somewhat glib conclusions about people blind him to the truth, and also perhaps help to blind the reader too. However, as Haywood stumbles through his investigation, it quickly becomes apparent that the Leonides household consists of several separate but interrelated family units, all of whom are deeply dysfunctional, and all of whom were in thrall to the patriarch Aristide right up until his death. Consequently, as the novel progresses, and each of the family members reveals their seething resentments and frustrated desires, it becomes clear that every single member of the dynasty had a potential reason for wanting to kill off the man who had so thoroughly controlled the whole family. And Christie is able to develop a really well-observed portrait of a poisonous family hierarchy. To account for the toxic family dynamic that she's created, the author develops a theme of genetic madness, the idea that some people are just born wrong, as she says, and that there's a streak of inherited insanity or crookedness within the Leonides family that ultimately leads to murder. However, interestingly, reading the book now in the 21st century, Christie's theory of genetic madness is actually undercut by her own writing. She was an acute observer of family dynamics, and she was able to write about them with clarity and precision. And as a result, even though she didn't seem to be quite aware of what she was depicting, it's obvious to a modern reader with an awareness of current psychological developments that what ails the Leonides family isn't inherited insanity, but rather a learned pattern of narcissistic behavior that's been passed down through the generations. Aristide has set an example of narcissistic control for his whole family to learn from and follow, which most of them do in various ways, either by adopting narcissistic traits themselves or by enabling the narcissistic traits of others. It's fascinating that Christie was able to delineate these relationships without actually appearing to be aware of the condition that she's describing. Nevertheless, her unflinching account of the dynamic that exists between the various members of the Leonides clan makes perfect psychological sense when viewed through the lens of a contemporary knowledge of narcissistic behavior. In one family member, that behavior tips into sociopathy, and in this respect, the murder that is central to Crooked House was perhaps way ahead of its time. If we look past Charles Hayward's clumsy prejudices and the author's own slightly antiquated theories about genetic madness, we can find an uncannily accurate depiction of a personality disorder that is still being investigated and studied today. This makes Crooked House an even more fascinating read, I think. It's another very compelling book, and although certain elements of her stories haven't aged well, Christie's talent for accurately observing social dynamics, along with her gift for satirical humour, and her ability to blend together dark and light subject matter, all combine to make her stories extremely potent and rather irresistible. When you then add in the elements that Christie is most famous for, her ingenious plot twists and her ability to create a fiendish puzzle, it's easy to see why her books remain so popular to this day. Agatha Christie is still the queen of crime, and I have no doubt that she'll continue to intrigue, astound, and entertain her readers for many generations to come. That brings me to the end of this talk about Agatha Christie, and I do hope you've enjoyed delving into her remarkable world with me. I hope too that you can join me again soon for another ASMR adventure. Until then, thank you for your company. Goodbye.